Picture a room you could die in 6 different ways before breakfast. Now fill it with fire on 3 sides. Add boiling water overhead, poison on every surface, and a floor slick with grease so old it has seeped into the stone itself. That's the kitchen of a Victorian townhouse, not a battlefield, not a factory floor, not the sewers people like to talk about when they want to shock you with how awful the past was. The kitchen, the heart of the house, the room that fed everyone, that kept everyone warm, that made the whole elegant machinery of Victorian domestic life run on time, and it was trying to kill you every single day. We talk about the Victorians and their indoor plumbing like it was the achievement of the age. And sure, yes, the flush toilet. Very exciting. Excellent invention. Nobody's arguing against the flush toilet. But while you were admiring the toilet, the kitchen maid was burning herself on the range for the 7th time before 6 in the morning. While you were marvelling at the gaslighting, the cook was mixing cleaning compounds that would take the skin off your hands by Tuesday. While you were reading about arsenic in wallpaper, nobody was mentioning that the arsenic was also in the candles and the curtains and the artificial flowers in the drawing room, and the person dusting those artificial flowers was 17 years old and didn't know what arsenic was. The most dangerous room in a Victorian house isn't the toilet. It never was. It's the kitchen. And tonight, we're going down there. Not as visitors, not as historians doing a walking tour of a preserved country house, peering through velvet ropes at a suspiciously clean iron range. We're going down the back stairs past the smell of coal and wet stone and something unidentifiable that has been simmering since yesterday. We're going below the line, below the floorboards, below everything that makes a Victorian house look civilized from the outside. We're going to where the work actually happened. I make these history stories, and I genuinely do not know if you listen to them to sleep or if you're all sitting there in the dark, wide awake, thinking about how you would have lasted maybe 48 hours as a Victorian kitchen maid before quitting, or dying, or both. Either way, welcome. Get comfortable. Pull your blanket up. You've got a warm bed and nobody's going to ask you to blacklead anything tonight. Here we go. The burn happens before you can stop it. You reach across the range for the salt box, the way you've done it 100 times in the past week, the way Mrs. Beale showed you on your second day, the way every kitchen maid in every house in London reaches for the salt box at 5:30 in the morning, when they're not quite awake yet, and the fire is already roaring because you lit it 40 minutes ago while it was still dark. And the sleeve of your dress catches the hot iron lip of the range. Not a graze, not near miss. Contact. Full, complete, horrible contact. The thick wool of your dress pressing against cast iron that has been burning coal since before you woke up, since before the scullery maid woke up, since before the cook came downstairs, since the fire has a head start on every human being in this house by at least an hour. The smell reaches you before the pain does. Burnt wool first, and under that, something else. Something that takes your brain a full second to process. That's you. That's your skin. You pull back, you don't cry out. You learned that in the first 3 days. You don't cry out in Mrs. Hartley's kitchen. You make mistakes quietly, suffer quietly, correct yourself quietly, and get back to work. Mrs. Hartley, cook, undisputed ruler of everything below the hallway, does not shout. She doesn't need to. She has a way of going very still when something displeases her, a particular quality of silence that is somehow worse than any amount of shouting. So you press your lips together and look at your forearm, and there it is, a mark, red and raw, about 3 inches long, just below the inside of your elbow where the skin is thinnest. It's already starting to weep. It will blister by mid-morning. By afternoon, you'll have to wrap it with a strip of cloth torn from one of your spare aprons, the grey ones, the ones you're not supposed to cut up but that everyone cuts up anyway, because burns happen every single day in this kitchen, and there is no formal arrangement for dealing with them beyond getting on with it. You set the salt box down on the work table. You press your other hand against the burn for 30 seconds, because cold would be better, but the water in the scullery sink will be freezing at this hour, and you can't leave the range right now because the porridge is on, and the toast has to be started, and the water for the upper floors has to be heated and carried up before 7:30, which is when the family begins to expect things, which is when the house above your head will start making demands on the house below it, the way it does every morning, the way it has done every morning for as long as anyone can remember, the way it will keep doing until the last coal is burned and the last maid has hung up her apron and walked out the back door. Your name is Agnes Marsh. You're 15 years old. You've been in London for 8 days and in service at number 14 Cadogan Gardens for 6 of them. You came from a village in Kent called Harrietsham, which is the kind of place where you know every face you pass on the road, and the biggest thing that happens in a given week is that a cart loses a wheel on the high street. You came here with a tin trunk, 2 aprons, 1 dress for best, and a letter of reference from the vicar's wife that described you as a diligent girl with a good character and strong hands. The strong hands part is already proving accurate. Everything else is still being tested. You knew what a kitchen maid did, in the abstract. You knew it was hard work. You knew it involved early mornings and late nights and a great deal of washing up. Your mother had worked in service before she married your father, and she told you, it's hard, but it's steady, and you'll be warm and fed, and that's more than most. She didn't tell you about the range. Nobody tells you about the range until you're standing in front of it. The range at number 14 is a Leamington Kitchener, all 6 feet of it. Cast iron and coal hunger and heat that radiates so intensely you can feel it through your dress from 2 feet away. It has a main firebox at the centre, an oven on the left, a separate warming oven on the right, 2 trivets for holding pots, a hot plate across the top, and a boiler at the far end that heats the water for the house. It weighs, Mrs. Hartley told you on your first day, approximately 650 pounds. It takes 40 minutes to bring to working temperature from cold. It is never allowed to go fully cold. Never. The fire is banked down at night, reduced to embers, but it never dies. And the first task of every single day, before tea, before washing your face, before anything that could be called human comfort, is you coming down here in the dark and feeding the fire. You are the fire's keeper. That is your job. That is the foundation of everything else the house does. Without you, and what you do down here in the dark before the rest of the world wakes up, breakfast doesn't happen. Hot water doesn't happen. The family upstairs doesn't start their day at 7:30 feeling like people of consequence. They start it cold and hungry and irritable, and that is not acceptable, and so it must never happen. And so you are here at 5 in the morning, 6 days into your employment, with a burn on your arm and the salt box in your hand and the porridge beginning to blister at the edges of the pot. You stir it, 3 times around, scraping the bottom, the way Mrs. Hartley showed you. The kitchen smells of coal smoke and yesterday's fat and the peculiar dry dust smell of the black lead you put on the range yesterday morning, which is a compound of graphite and other things that leave your hands grey until Thursday, and your lungs with a faint metallic taste that you're starting to think might just be permanent. It smells of the washing soda that's been soaking in the scullery sink since last night. Sharp and alkaline, the kind of clean that isn't really clean so much as chemically stripped. It smells of the damp that lives in the walls of this basement kitchen, which has never fully dried out in the 30 years it has been a kitchen, which will never fully dry out in the next 30, which is simply what stone floors and underground rooms smell like when they're full of steam and condensation every single day. And underneath all of that, the faintest trace of something sweet and slightly wrong, which you cannot identify and which nobody has explained to you yet, and which you will learn by April is the smell that comes out of the walls when the gas pressure drops and the pipes start to seep. But that's April. Right now it's January. Right now it's the 4th of January 1882, and the city above you is still mostly asleep, and the range is burning and the porridge needs stirring, and somewhere in the ceiling above your head you can hear the first faint sounds of the house beginning to wake up. Welcome to number 14, Cadogan Gardens. Welcome to the kitchen. The kitchen is below street level. Everything important about this house is below street level, which is one of the first things you have to understand about how these places work. Because from the outside, from the pavement, you see the front door up 6 steps with its black iron railing and its polished brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. And you might think you understand what kind of house this is. You might think you've seen it whole. You haven't. You've seen the surface, the presentation, the part that's meant to be seen. The real house goes down. The kitchen is the largest room in the basement, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a ceiling that's just barely tall enough for Mrs. Hartley to stand upright without hunching, which she does anyway, a habit of years spent in rooms exactly this height. There's one window, set high in the wall and level with the pavement outside, protected by iron bars and a stone ledge on which things accumulate. Leaves, soot, the occasional pigeon, rain. The window faces north. In January it gets about 4 hours of grey, thin, entirely inadequate light. The rest of the time you work by gaslight. A single burner on the wall by the range, another above the main work table hissing softly, throwing a yellowish light that makes everything look slightly unwell. The work table runs down the centre of the room. Solid wood, heavily scored with knife marks, scrubbed raw every evening with a brush and soda crystals. This is where you prep the vegetables, where you roll the pastry, where Mrs. Hartley does her proper cooking work, the complicated work, the work that requires skill and judgment and 20 years of experience and a very sharp knife. Along the wall opposite the range, shelves, rows of them, floor to ceiling, organised with a precision that would impress a sergeant major. Copper pots, sorted by size, enamelled casseroles, put in basins, stacked in a column of decreasing diameter, jelly moulds in the shape of fish and turrets and classical vases, tin roasting pans, an earthenware crock of dripping with a cloth cover, a gallon jar of rendering lard that leaves an oily mark on the shelf no matter how many times you clean it. On the top shelf, arranged in a row and facing outward, Mrs. Beale's books. Not Mrs. Beeton. Mrs. Beale is Mrs. Hartley's predecessor's predecessor, a cook who worked here in the 1850s and left her notebooks behind, and whose recipes Mrs. Hartley consults with the reverence that borders on religious. Mrs. Beeton's book, the famous one, the one your mother mentioned, is there too, thick as a Bible, spine cracked from use. You haven't been allowed to touch it yet. You haven't been here long enough. The scullery is through the door at the far end. Smaller, damper, colder, always. A deep stone sink under another barred window. A wooden draining board so saturated with water and soap over the years that it has turned almost black. 2 buckets, a scrub and brush, a lye bar for heavy washing. This is where you live most of your day, really. The scullery is your domain the way the range is Mrs. Hartley's. You're responsible for everything that comes in dirty and goes back out clean, which in a household this size is an unending and slightly Sisyphean task. Next to the scullery, the coal hole. There's no good way to describe the coal hole except to say that it is a hole. It is full of coal, and it is the reason your hands will be permanently grey for the next several years of your life. It's accessed through a wooden hatch in the floor of the scullery, just big enough to lower yourself through if you turn sideways. Below that, a vaulted cellar space, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with a chute coming through the wall that connects to the iron plate in the pavement above. Once a week the coalman comes. You hear him before you see him, the iron plate lifting, the rumble of coal coming down the chute, the crash and pile and dust cloud that fills the cellar and drifts up through the hatch into the scullery and settles on everything in a fine black film. You go down with a bucket and a scoop. 3 times a day minimum, more in cold weather. Down the narrow steps, into the dark, filling the bucket, carrying it up. 3 buckets per trip. Coal is heavy. A full scuttle weighs about 25 pounds. You're 15 and weigh just over 7 stone, and you're going to be very strong in your shoulders by spring. The coal is black and sharp-edged, and leaves cuts along your palms when you scoop it wrong. It smells of sulphur and ancient pressure, and something mineral and cold. The coal dust gets into everything, your hair, your nose, the back of your throat. By the end of the day, you blow your nose and the cloth comes away black. You have stopped being surprised by this. You have started cautiously to feel this is normal. Mrs. Hartley arrived in the kitchen at 6 exactly, the way she does every morning, and she looked at your arm in the way she looks at everything, briefly, completely, with an assessment already made before you've had time to prepare a response. "Wrap it after breakfast," she said. "There's clean cloth in the top drawer of the dresser." "Yes, Mrs. Hartley." "How deep?" You looked at it again. It had gone from red to something angrier, the edges already rising. "Not deep, I think." "Blister?" "Starting to." "Cold water tonight. Don't touch it during the day." "Keep your sleeve rolled down." She paused. She was already looking at the porridge. "This is burning at the bottom." "Yes, Mrs. Hartley, I was—" "Stir it properly. 3 times around, then across, not circles. You'll build up the bottom layer if you go in circles." "Yes, Mrs. Hartley." She picked up the long-handled spoon, demonstrated once, 3 sweeps around the outer edge, then a slow pull across the diameter, scraping as she went, and handed it back. You took it. She moved to the other end of the range and began testing the water temperature in the boiler with her hand held flat above the steam. Slightly under pressure, she said to herself as much as to you. "Add more coal, small pieces, don't flood it." That is a characteristic Mrs. Hartley exchange. Clear, economical, containing no wasted words and no unnecessary softness. She is not a cruel woman. You understood that within 2 days, which was faster than you expected. She is not malicious. She does not shout or humiliate or take pleasure in your failures the way you'd been warned some cooks did. She simply has no interest whatsoever in the psychological comfort of the people who work under her. She has a kitchen to run. You are part of the kitchen. You perform your function or you're replaced by someone who can. Mrs. Hartley is 47 years old, from Shropshire originally, has been in service since she was 13. 34 years. She can look at a joint of beef and tell you within 2 minutes how it should be cooked, at what temperature for how long, and what's wrong with the butcher who cut it. She can make a sauce for 8 that tastes as if she's been standing over it for days when she's actually been doing 6 other things simultaneously. Her pastry is famous in a small and specific way, meaning that the family upstairs requests it by name, and guests ask Mrs. Pemberton. That's the mistress, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, who does the pastry. Mrs. Hartley does the pastry. Mrs. Hartley does everything that requires actual culinary skill. You do everything that requires labour. That is the division of the kitchen. There is also Lizzie. Lizzie is the scullery maid, 13 years old, from somewhere in the East End, though she's vague about exactly where, in the way that people from the East End are sometimes vague about exactly where, as if the specifics might invite a question they don't want to answer. She arrived a month before you did. She has already worked out the complete geography of this kitchen, which floorboards creak, which drawer sticks, which corner of the coal hole smells worst when it's wet. With the expertise of someone who has had to learn environments quickly before. Lizzie is small and quick and permanently cold. She wears 2 extra layers even in the range's heat. Her hands are red and rough and several sizes older than the rest of her. Hands that have been in cold water and hot water and soda water and every kind of water all day, every day since October. She doesn't complain about them. You haven't heard Lizzie complain about much, actually, which at first you thought was stoicism, and which you're beginning to think might be something more complicated than that. She appeared in the scullery doorway right after Mrs. Hartley's porridge correction, and she looked at your arm the way she looked at everything, matter-of-factly, cataloguing the information, filing it away. Range again? Yes. Left side or right side of the firebox? Left, near the salt. You've got to watch the left side corner. The lip extends about a 1/4 inch further than it looks. I got it there my second day. She showed you her left forearm, a faint scar about 2 inches already going pale, old enough to be forgetting itself. Does it stop happening, you asked. She thought about it. You stop getting surprised by it, she said. I'm not sure that's the same thing. And then she went back to the scullery because the vegetable crates had been delivered and needed unpacking, and if the parsnips weren't prepped by 7, the cook couldn't start the soup base, and the soup base had to be started early because it needed 3 hours, and you all knew this, and there was no world in which the soup base didn't happen, so the parsnips happened first. This is the grammar of the kitchen. Everything must happen in a particular order, at a particular time, in service of meals that happen at times the family sets and which are non-negotiable. Breakfast at 7:30, luncheon at 1, dinner at 7:30, tea at 4, and underneath each of those a preparation timeline that works backward through the morning, the afternoon, the day, with every task mapped to every other task in a chain of dependency, so intricate that if one thing goes wrong, the next 4 things teeter. You are 15 years old, and you have been here 6 days, and you're already beginning to understand that running this kitchen is a form of logistics that would not shame a military operation, that Mrs. Hartley carries it all in her head, the whole structure, every variable, every timing, every temperature, that she has been doing this so long that it has stopped being knowledge and become instinct, the way a musician eventually stops thinking about the notes. You are at the very beginning of that process. You're still very much thinking about the notes. And the range is burning, and the porridge needs another stir, and the coal needs adding, and the water for the family's morning washing. 3 jugs per bedroom, with the water at a specific temperature that Mrs. Pemberton had conveyed through the housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, as comfortable but not scalding, needed to be filled and carried up the back stairs before 7:15, which was in 1 hour and 45 minutes, which was both a very long time and no time at all. You stirred the porridge, 3 times around, then across, the proper way. Carrying the water upstairs is one of the things that gives you a version of the house you would not otherwise see. You live below, the family lives above. Between those two worlds there is a set of back stairs, narrow and uncarpeted, running from the basement all the way up to the attics where the upper servants sleep. The stairs are steep. The treads are worn smooth in the centre from decades of feet going up and down with their hands full. There is a rope fixed to the wall that serves as a banister, not elegant but functional, and you hold it every time because you've been going up these stairs at least 6 times a day since you arrived, and once, on your 3rd morning, exhausted and not paying attention. You missed a step in the dark and only the rope saved you from going down very fast and very badly. The jugs are heavy when full. Copper, with handles that get hot from the water inside. You carry 2 at a time, 3 jugs per bedroom, 2 bedrooms on the 1st floor. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton sleep separately, which is common enough in houses like this, so 6 trips minimum, plus 2 for the guest room when it's occupied, plus the water for the day nursery when the children are home, which they aren't this week because Master Charles and Miss Harriet are both at school, but will be back at Easter, and then the stairwork doubles. The back stairs come out through a door into a corridor on each floor that runs parallel to the main corridor but is hidden from it by a wall. You are meant to be invisible. This isn't an instruction exactly. Nobody sat you down and said, "Be invisible, Agnes." But it is so deeply woven into the structure of how the house functions that it operates as a physical law. If you come out of the back stairs into the main corridor when a member of the family or a guest is present, you step back, you wait, you let them pass, you do not make eye contact, you do not speak unless spoken to, and if spoken to you answer briefly and remove yourself as quickly as possible. The family is not supposed to see the mechanism, they are supposed to experience the result. The hot water, the clean room, the fire laid and burning, the meals appearing, without the labour that produced them being visible. This is the contract. This is how the thing works. You knew this in theory. You're learning it in practice and finding it stranger than you expected. Not cruel, strange. The particular strangeness of being present and absent at the same time, of moving through spaces and not existing in them, of being completely necessary and completely invisible simultaneously. On your 2nd day, Mrs. Pemberton came down the main stairs as you were coming up the back stairs with the water, and through the gap in the corridor door you saw her for the first time at close range. She's perhaps 35, fair, elegantly built, wearing a morning wrapper of pale grey silk that probably cost more than your annual wage. She was speaking to someone, to Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, about arrangements for a dinner party. Her voice was pleasant, and her hands moved slightly as she talked, emphasizing something about the table setting. She looked, from your narrow angle, like a woman who lived in a world where hot water arrived and rooms were warm and food appeared, where the machinery of domestic life was simply the background condition of existence. She didn't see you. You closed the gap in the door. You carried the water to the rooms. You poured the jugs into the washstand basins. You made sure the towels were straight. You went back down the stairs. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hartley had the butter out and was testing it with her thumb, checking its temperature with a sureness of touch that you will not possess for years. "Water's done," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Hartley. Lay the breakfast tray, the coffee and the toast rack and the butter pot. Leave the porridge warming, then start on the luncheon vegetables. You laid the breakfast tray. You started on the vegetables. This is what the day is." The range itself is the centre of everything, the axis around which the kitchen orbits, the thing that requires the most attention, the most maintenance, the most respect, and also the thing most likely to hurt you. It is not simply a stove in the way that you might think of a stove. It is a machine, a coal-fired machine that requires constant management and that, if mismanaged, can go from merely demanding to actively dangerous in a way that takes maybe 8 seconds and no further warning. Let me tell you about black-leading the range, because this is one of those things that nobody who has not done it can fully imagine. Black-leading is the process of cleaning and polishing the cast iron. You do it every morning, and you do it before the fire is fully lit, which means you're doing it while the range is warm but not roaring, which is a temperature that falls in the uncomfortable middle ground between cold enough to touch and hot enough to burn you. The compound you use is called blacklead, or sometimes blacking, and it's a mix of graphite and other proprietary ingredients. The tin says globe polish, and that's all the information you're getting. That you work into the iron with a stiff brush and then buff off with a softer brush until the range gleams. The graphite gets everywhere, into every crack in your skin, under your fingernails, into the lines of your palms so that your hands look for the first week like you've been drawing maps in charcoal. Mrs. Hartley's hands have a permanent grey quality to them. Not dirty exactly, but tinted, as if the metal has claimed some small part of her skin as its own, after 30 years of daily contact. You breathe it in while you work, fine particles rising from the brush strokes, settling in your nose, on your tongue. You learn to keep your face low and your breathing shallow, which helps somewhat. You clean the range, you polish it until it shines. You feel, briefly, a professional satisfaction in the gleam of well-maintained metal. Then the fire catches properly and the heat begins to build, and within 20 minutes the gorgeous gleam is covered in a thin layer of coal smoke and condensation, and it must all be done again tomorrow morning. Every morning, for years. You're 15 years old and you're going to do this until you're promoted to cook or you leave service, whichever comes first. If everything goes well, if you're good enough, and learn fast enough, and manage not to do anything terrible, you might be a cook in 8 or 10 years, a cook in a good house, with your own kitchen maid, looking at a new girl's burned arm and telling her to wrap it after breakfast. That's the future, if the future is kind. But you're not thinking about that yet. You're thinking about the parsnips, which need scraping, and the coal, which needs bringing up, and the burn on your arm, which has settled into a low, steady throb that you can mostly ignore if you don't bend that elbow too sharply. The parsnips come from Covent Garden Market, delivered to the area steps at 5:30 in the morning by a man named Sid, who works for the greengrocer on Sloane Street. You never see Sid. He's gone by the time you get to the delivery. But you see evidence of him every morning. A wooden crate of whatever is seasonal, a smaller basket of herbs if Mrs. Hartley ordered them, and occasionally a handwritten note with a substitution or an apology about the quality of something that was promised. In January, seasonal means root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, carrots, swedes, onions, leeks, which smell of the wet fields they came from even after you've cleaned them, potatoes, which are the bulk of everything, pounds and pounds of them every day, peeled and boiled and mashed and roasted and turned into soups, and incorporated into pies, and otherwise transformed into the carbohydrate foundation of most of what the family eats. Peeling potatoes is not skilled work, but it takes time. Each potato individually, the peel coming off in long strips if you're efficient, in short broken pieces if you're not yet practiced. the white starchy interior cold and slightly slimy from the cellar storage. You do maybe 50 potatoes for a day's cooking. 50 potatoes is a pile roughly the size of a large dog. It takes about 40 minutes if you're working steadily, your hands in the cold water of the scullery sink, working the peeler, the potato turning in your grip, the skin of your palm starting to wrinkle from the water, the burn on your forearm staying dry, thank you, because you've learned to hold the arm angled away, the smell of raw potato, green and starchy and faintly of the earth, an honest smell, a smell from home, Harrietsham in summer, the kitchen garden behind the rectory, where you sometimes worked for a few pennies in the school holidays, the smell of warm earth and growing things, which is so completely different from the smell of London earth, which is not really earth at all, but a compacted mixture of soot and ash, and decades of urban accumulation that sometimes you catch a whiff of something that reminds you of it. A bunch of parsley, a head of celery, and for a second you're somewhere else entirely. Then you're back, scullery sink, January, the range hissing through the wall. You've learned, in 6 days, a particular efficiency with your attention, the part of your mind that used to wander, to think about people back home, to compose letters to your mother that you haven't had time to write, to wonder how long until Sunday, which is the only afternoon you have off. That part has quieted. Not gone, but quieter. It seems to understand that there's no room for it during working hours. It waits, patient and slightly resentful for the moments between tasks. Survival instinct, maybe, or just what happens when the work is constant enough that distraction becomes a liability. Mrs. Hartley appeared in the scullery doorway. Parsnips. Almost done. When you're finished, the range needs another feed. Then come to me in the kitchen. I want to show you the soup base before I start it so you understand the sequence. This is another Mrs. Hartley characteristic. She teaches. Not warmly. She doesn't narrate her instructions with encouragement, or ask you how you're getting on, or check in on your feelings about the process. But she consistently, methodically shows you things, explains things, assumes that you're capable of learning and that learning is the appropriate response to not yet knowing. In 6 days you have learned the proper temperature of the range at various stages, and how to read it by the colour of the fire visible through the firebox door. The organisation of the dresser shelves and the principle behind it, most used at arm height, least used above and below, the proper way to prep vegetables for different cooking methods, how to distinguish between the stock pot, which lives permanently on the back trivet and is added to and drawn from across the week, and the soup pot, which is a fresh construction. How to read the kitchen's morning schedule from the list Mrs. Hartley writes each evening in a small brown notebook and leaves on the work table, and that Mrs. Hartley's slight pause before speaking means she's about to correct you, and you should stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. You're not a fast learner in the schoolroom sense. You never were particularly, though you could read and write, which not everyone your age could. But you are a thorough learner, and you have very good hands, and you have a capacity for concentration under discomfort. That is either a natural gift or a thing you are developing very rapidly under circumstances that demand it. The soup base. Mrs. Hartley put the stock pot on the front trivet, closer to the fire, hotter, and began. Observe what I do. Don't do anything. Watch. She took the rendered beef stock from the cold larder, the stone shelf built into the north wall of the kitchen, recessed and ventilated, where perishables were kept in winter, and poured it into a wide, heavy pot. It had set overnight into a pale brown jelly, glistening and dense with collagen. The smell of it, cold, was clean and mineral, beef and thyme and reduction. She set this on the heat. She took her knife, a different knife from the vegetable knife, longer, heavier in the blade, one she sharpened herself on a leather strop every morning, and without looking at you, without breaking the rhythm of what she was doing, began to explain. A soup base isn't the soup. People confuse them. The base is the architecture. The soup is what you build on it. Get the architecture wrong and nothing you put on top of it will be right. She laid in onions, halved, cut side down against the base of the pot. No fat yet. She was letting them char slightly against the dry surface, building colour, building depth. Temperature matters before flavour. If this isn't hot enough when you start, the onions will sweat instead of colour, and the base will be sweet when it should be savoury. Too hot and they burn and you've lost it entirely. The range will be between those temperatures for about the next 30 minutes, while the fire builds to full working heat. You have to use that window. The onions hit the surface of the pot with a sound like a careful exhale. They began immediately to go to work. How do you know which window, you asked, because this seemed like the most important question. Mrs. Hartley was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the onions. You learn what it sounds like, she said. The sizzle is different from the scorch. You learn to hear the difference. It takes time. She added the carrots, then celery, the outer sticks, slightly bitter, good for stocks. Then a tied bunch of parsley stems and thyme and a bay leaf, which she called a bouquet garni with no particular ceremony, just the French term for the thing, matter of fact. Don't touch this pot for 40 minutes. Don't move it. Don't stir it. Don't lift the lid. If you're close enough to smell it, you're too close. Let it do its work. She stepped back. The pot settled into its long, slow work, invisible alchemy happening under the lid, and Mrs. Hartley was already moving to the next thing, the pastry dough she'd set to rest overnight, the cold butter block from the larder, her mind already 3 steps ahead. You stood and watched the pot for 30 seconds, which was exactly as long as you could afford, and then went back to the parsnips. Here is the thing about the kitchen that you're only beginning to understand. It is 2 things at once, and the 2 things are in permanent productive tension. The first thing, it is a workplace of extraordinary skill. What Mrs. Hartley does, what a good cook does, is technical and creative and demanding in ways that you will spend years learning, and that even at the end of your career you will still be refining. The timing, the chemistry of heat and food, the sensory judgment that tells you when something is right, the management of multiple preparations happening simultaneously. This is not simple work. It requires the same quality of attention that surgery requires, that engineering requires, that any craft at its highest level requires. The second thing, it is a workplace that is trying to kill you, not metaphorically, not in the way that people say about stressful jobs. Literally, the range is hot enough to blister skin on contact. The boiling water that moves around this kitchen all day can cause serious scalds in under a second. The cleaning chemicals you handle, washing soda, lye, carbolic acid, which Mrs. Hartley uses on the scullery sink once a week, will burn your skin with different levels of enthusiasm. The knives are extremely sharp. The pots are heavy and the floors are slick with grease, and the stairs are steep and unlit, and the coal hole is exactly wide enough to fall through if you're not careful. And none of this is remarkable. None of this is considered dangerous in any official sense. There is no law protecting you from it. There is no compensation if you're hurt. There is no sick pay. because there is no pay at all for days you cannot work, and if you're hurt badly enough that you cannot work for an extended period, you will be replaced. This is not malice. It is simply the terms. You agreed to them, insofar as a 15-year-old girl from a Kent village, presented with the options of this or considerably worse, can be said to agree to anything. The kitchen feeds you and houses you, and pays you £9 a year, which rises to 12 after your first year if you're kept on, and the work is relentless, and the hazards are constant, and the burn on your arm is going to scar, and that is simply how it is. London, in January 1882. The afternoon of your first full Sunday off, your actual Sunday, the first one since you arrived, you went above ground. This requires emphasis. You had been below ground, or effectively below ground, since Monday. The kitchen, the scullery, the coal hole, the back stairs, the quick transits through the basement corridor to the larder, and the servants' hall and back. Your world, for 6 days, had been bounded by stone walls and the hissing gaslight and the 4-foot width of the back staircase. You had not seen the sky except through the barred window, which showed you a narrow strip of it, generally grey, generally producing either cold rain or the particular quality of winter light that is less illumination than the absence of complete darkness. On Sunday afternoon, at 2 o'clock, wearing your good dress, the one your mother bought for you before you left, dark blue wool, properly fitted, the one that marks you as respectable rather than ragged, you walked up the area steps to the pavement of Cadogan Gardens and stood in London. The sky was white, cold and white and enormous, taking up more of your visual field than seemed physically possible after a week in a room with a window the size of a letter. The air tasted of coal smoke and ice, and something you couldn't name, a faint green smell that made no sense in January until you realised you were smelling the parks, Ranelagh Gardens nearby, dormant and brown but still alive somewhere beneath the frost, still exhaling whatever it is that parks exhale, even when everything living in them has gone underground. Your breath came out in clouds. You had directions from Lizzie, who had been here a month and had done more exploring. Go along the King's Road, turn left past the shops, follow the crowd toward the Chelsea embankment, and you'll find yourself somewhere that isn't a kitchen. You went. The streets of Chelsea on a Sunday afternoon were not the streets of Harrietsham on a Sunday afternoon. They were not even the London you'd seen in brief and terrifying glimpses when you arrived. The station, the hansom cab, the front of the house, all passing in a blur of overwhelm. These were streets with a particular quality to them. Neither the grand commercial width of the main thoroughfares nor the narrow compressed alleyways of the poorer quarters. Streets of terraced houses and small shops closed for the Sabbath, and bare plane trees with their mottled bark and the occasional well-dressed couple, walking a dog of the kind that costs more money than you will earn this year. You walked with your arms slightly out from your sides because everything about the way you moved had been recalibrated for tight spaces and obstacle navigation and carrying things, and the open pavement felt almost disconcertingly wide. A woman with a perambulator, an old man reading a newspaper on a bench, apparently unbothered by the cold. 2 boys running past, chased by a third, all of them laughing at something you hadn't heard. A cart horse standing in its traces, patient and substantial, steaming gently in the cold air. You had never seen Chelsea before this week. You had never been to London before this week, in the sense of actually being in it rather than passing through it. Harrietsham is not close to London. Harrietsham is a village in Kent where, when you were growing up, London was the place people went to when the local options ran out, when there was nothing left in the village for you, when the small circumference of fields and lanes and familiar faces had been measured and found to contain insufficient future. Your mother before you left. Be careful. Which was not advice exactly, but more a condensation of everything she knew about cities and couldn't say in the time available. Your father before you left. Write when you can. Which was his way of saying he would miss you, because your father didn't say the thing directly. He never did. Your younger brother Thomas, who is 12 and wanted to see the train. He just waved until the platform was gone. The embankment, when you reached it, had a quality of release about it. After the compressed street grid, the river opened the world sideways. The Thames at Chelsea in January, grey-green and muscular, catching the weak light on its surface and doing complicated things with it. The opposite bank, Battersea, less formal, the industrial silhouette of chimneys, and the low roofline of buildings that hadn't been polished up yet. You sat on a bench. You sat on a bench by the river on a Sunday afternoon in January 1882, and you did not do anything for approximately 20 minutes. This is remarkable. This sounds like nothing, but it was remarkable. 20 minutes in which nobody needed you to stir anything, or carry anything, or fetch anything, or be anywhere. 20 minutes in which the city went about its business without requiring your participation, in which you were not part of the mechanism, in which you were just a person, sitting by a river, with a burn on your arm and cold hands and soot permanently tinted into the creases of your palms, existing. A barge passed, low in the water, loaded with something heavy and covered by tarpaulin. The waterman at the stern barely moving his sweep oar, tiny adjustments keeping the massive flat hull in its line. He didn't look at the shore. He'd probably passed this bench 10,000 times. You thought about Mrs. Hartley's soup base, which had finished just before luncheon, and which had tasted, when you were allowed a small amount mixed with yesterday's bread for your own midday meal, of something deep and serious and complex in a way you were only beginning to have a language for. You thought about the correct way to hold the scrubbing brush against the range surface, which Mrs. Hartley had corrected 3 times that morning. You thought about the parsnips and whether you'd scrape them close enough to the skin. There was more flavour there, Mrs. Hartley said, and most people wasted it. You thought about Thomas at the train station. You thought about your mother's kitchen, which was small and cramped, and nothing like Mrs. Hartley's kitchen. And yet, in the smell of it, bread and coal and something sweet that was probably the apple tree outside the window, was more familiar than anything in this city yet. The cold was getting into your boots. You had been told the cold in London is different from country cold. Country cold is clean and moves. London cold is static and wet. It sits in the stone and the brick and it seeps. It gets into shoes through the pavement. It gets into rooms through the walls. It is a cold that has soaked into the fabric of the city over generations and made itself permanent. You didn't know if that was true precisely. But your feet were cold in a way that felt deliberate. You stood up. You had another hour. You walked along the embankment toward the Albert Bridge, which was not quite finished. The construction scaffolding was still up on one end, and a few workmen were moving round on it despite the Sunday. And you stood and looked at it for a while, this extraordinary thing, this cast-iron lace suspended over the river. You had never seen a suspension bridge before. The way the cables rose from the towers in delicate fans, holding the roadway up against gravity through pure geometry, was one of those things that made you feel briefly very small and very provincial, and also slightly transcendent, as if the fact of this thing existing in the world meant that other things you hadn't imagined might also exist. The river below it moved without caring about the bridge. The river had been here longer than every bridge. It would be here longer than this one. You walked back. You bought a penny bun from a woman selling them from a basket near Sloane Square. Hot, slightly sweet, smelling of yeast and butter, nothing special and exactly what you needed. And ate it walking, which your mother would have told you was common, and which you did anyway because there was nobody here who knew your mother. The area steps at number 14. The kitchen door. The smell of the kitchen hitting you from 3 steps above. Coal and dripping, and the faintly metallic bottom note of the range, which is always there, which will become so familiar over the years that the day you leave service you'll walk into any kitchen, and that smell will bring you back to yourself the way certain songs bring you back to places. But that's the future. Right now, your apron, which is hanging on its hook just inside the kitchen door, your proper work apron, the blue cotton one with the 2 big pockets, slightly stiff from yesterday's starch. You take it down and put it on. You retie your hair. You check the time, the clock above the dresser, black face with gilt hands, practical and slightly ugly. And you have 17 minutes before the evening routine begins. You fill the coal bucket. Monday. Monday in a Victorian household kitchen is a particular thing. You learn this in your second week, having missed the first one due to arriving mid-week and spending most of your first Monday too overwhelmed to notice the specific quality of it. Monday is washing day, the laundry, the copper. If the range is the centre of the kitchen's danger, the laundry copper is the centre of its own separate geography of risk, located in the scullery's back corner, behind the main sink, built into the wall like a small permanent fixture of masonry and iron. The copper is a large hemispherical iron tub, maybe 3 feet across, set into a brick surround with a fireplace underneath it. You fill it with water from the pump. You light the fire underneath it. You wait for the water to boil, and it does boil, fully, rolling boil, steam rising in great clouds that fill the scullery and drift into the kitchen and condense on every cold surface. This is where the household linens go. The sheets, the towels, the napery, the shirt fronts, the undergarments and the petticoats and the cotton voile that the upper servants send down, and the heavier cottons that the lower servants wash themselves. All of it, categorized and sorted and put through the boiling water and then hauled out with wooden tongs, long-handled but not long enough, never quite long enough, and transferred to the rinse water in the big tub, and then to the wringer, and then to drying. The thing about laundry day is the steam. The scullery fills with it. The walls run with condensation. Your clothes are damp within 10 minutes of starting work and stay damp until you change in the evening. Your hair goes limp and frizzes and escapes its pins. The windows fog completely. The gaslight flickers in the moisture-laden air, and the lifting. Wet sheets weigh considerably more than dry sheets. Wet linen in general is dense and awkward, and has no interest in being moved from one place to another. You lift it with the tongs, which have a grip that is partly mechanical and partly the squeeze of your own hands through the handles, and transfer it to the rinse tub, where you plunge your arms in up to the elbows in water that is hot but not boiling, working the fabric to get the soap out. Hot but not boiling is relative. Hot enough to redden your arms. Hot enough that by the afternoon the skin on your forearms, both of them now, the burned one and the plain one, has the slightly taut quality of overcooked meat. On your second Monday you were rinsing a sheet that had gotten wound around the tongs when it slipped. The loose end of the sheet fell back into the copper, the boiling water copper, not the rinse tub, and you reached without thinking because that was the instinct. Grab it before it goes under, and the back of your right hand went into the water. The pain was immediate and complete and entirely different from the range burn. The range burn was a moment, contact and release. This was a saturation, heat entering the skin all at once, and the second between impact and reaction felt very long. You pulled back. You held your hand over the tub. Lizzie appeared from somewhere. She was always appearing from somewhere, alert to the sounds of small catastrophes. "Under the cold pump," she said. "Now, go." You went to the pump in the corner of the scullery and worked the handle until the water came cold and clean from the pipes, and held your hand under it. The contrast was extreme enough to make your eyes water. "Keep it there. Don't stop." You kept it there. The cold worked. Cold. The fire in your skin backed down from screaming to tolerable in about 2 minutes, and from tolerable to bad in about 5, and from bad to manageable in about 15, by which time your hand was a brilliant red, and your right wrist ached from holding the position, and the sheet was still floating in the copper, thoroughly soaked and needed dealing with. Mrs. Hartley appeared in the scullery doorway at some point during the pump holding. She looked at your hand. She looked at the copper. "How long has it been in there?" "About 15 minutes, since the slip." "Sheet will be fine. Your hand?" "Red, not blistered, not yet." She came fully into the scullery, took your hand by the wrist, not gently, but competently, the way you might hold a piece of equipment you're assessing, turned it over, examined the back. "First degree, you were lucky. Keep the cold water on it for another 10 minutes, then dry it and keep it dry. If it blisters significantly by tomorrow morning, tell me before you start work." She put your hand back under the pump. She went to the copper and retrieved the sheet herself with the tongs, with an efficiency that suggested she had done this approximately 400 times. "You grabbed for it," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it was falling. Instinct." She laid the sheet across the rinse tub, working out the wrinkles with one hand. Instinct is useful for many things. In the laundry room, instinct kills people. You must override it. If something falls into the copper, you leave it. You use the tongs. You never reach. Not for anything. Not for any reason. She said this without anger, without drama, as a statement of fact, not for any reason. "Has someone," you began, "a girl at my previous situation, 15, similar to your situation, a pot slipped from the hook above the copper, and she reached for it without thinking. Both arms up to the elbow, a pause. She kept them, but they weren't quite right after. Not for fine work." She folded the sheet with a briskness that signalled the conversation was finished. "Not for any reason," she said again. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Hartley." She went back to the kitchen. You held your hand under the cold water for another 7 minutes, which you counted, and you thought about the girl. 15, like you, reaches for the pot, and afterward her hands aren't quite right, and you thought, "This kitchen is patient. It will wait for the moment when you forget, when instinct overrides training, when the fraction of a second between thinking and doing is the fraction that matters. This kitchen is not trying to kill you out of malice. It simply doesn't care whether you live or not. The copper doesn't care. The range doesn't care. The chemicals in the cleaning cupboard don't care. They are what they are, and what they are is dangerous, and the only thing between you and that danger is knowledge and habit and the slow, careful accumulation of practiced caution. You are building that knowledge. You are building that habit. Every day, every burn, every near miss adds to a layer of understanding that will eventually become second nature. You're not there yet. You're very much not there yet. Your hand stopped being dramatic by the next morning. A patch of red, slightly sensitive to pressure. No blisters. Lucky. Lizzie watched you unwrap it at the start of your shift and said nothing, but the way she nodded at you when you rolled your sleeve down had in it something almost collegial. Let me tell you about the chemicals, because the burns from the copper and the range are the obvious dangers, the ones with clear causes and immediate consequences, the ones you can point to and say, that is what did this. The chemicals are more patient. In the cleaning cupboard, a narrow closet off the scullery, latched but not locked, accessible to anyone who needs it, there are a tin of washing soda crystals, which you use for heavy cleaning of the range surround and the stone floor, a bar of laundry soap, yellow and hard and smelling of fat and alkali, a bottle of carbolic acid, which Mrs. Hartley dilutes with water for disinfecting the scullery sink, a tin of cream of tartar for cleaning the copper pots, a bottle of turpentine used occasionally for cleaning grease from stone floors and always making your head feel strange within 5 minutes if you're working with it in an unventilated space, a block of black lead for the range, and a box of safety matches, which are not entirely safe, but which are considerably safer than the earlier phosphorus matches, which were so reliably dangerous that the people who made them in the match factories developed a condition called phossy jaw, which is a necrosis of the jawbone caused by white phosphorus exposure, which is one of those things that sounds like it might be an exaggeration, until you see an illustration of it, which you have not and will not, because they're not printed in the newspapers you have access to, and in some ways that is a mercy. The washing soda you use daily. Bare hands, generally, because gloves make the scrubbing less effective, and because there is no tradition of kitchen maids wearing protective equipment, and the concept of occupational safety is not yet a framework that your employer thinks in. The soda is alkaline, strongly alkaline, and it strips oils from surfaces and from skin with equal enthusiasm. After 3 weeks, your hands have a quality they didn't have before. Tighter, the outer layers thinner, the creases in your knuckles deeper and redder, as if the top stratum of your skin has been gradually removed and not yet replaced. Your hands crack in the cold. The cracks don't heal properly because they're back in water and soda the next morning. You rub goose grease into them at night, which helps. Lizzie told you about the goose grease. There's a pot of it in the larder, kept there specifically for this purpose, which suggests that this is a known and expected condition of the work. The carbolic is more acute. You only handle it when Mrs. Hartley instructs it, once a week or after a specific contamination of the sink, and you dilute it yourself under her supervision. The smell is sharp and antiseptic, the smell of hospitals and serious cleaning. Undiluted, it will cause a chemical burn in under a minute of contact. Diluted, it will cause a mild burn given enough time. You treat it with appropriate respect. You pour carefully, you rinse the bottleneck, you don't splash. The turpentine makes your head feel like a small, mean man has taken up residence behind your eyes and is knocking softly on the inside of your skull. This is the solvent vapour doing something to your nervous system. You have not yet been told this is what's happening. You've been told, open the window and don't take too long. But your body gives you clear feedback in the form of the headache and the slightly detached quality of your vision for an hour afterward. None of this is accidental. None of this is carelessness. It is simply how the work is done. These are the tools of the trade. You use them because they work, because they clean what needs cleaning, because the alternative is a house that is not clean, and this house will be clean. There are things in this house you will not learn about until you've been here longer. The green room. The drawing room at number 14 is painted in a deep rich shade of green that Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, calls Venetian green, and which Mrs. Pemberton chose herself from a book of colour samples about 3 years ago, when the room was last redecorated. It is very fashionable. It is the kind of green that photographs of the period will look almost black, but in the room itself, in gaslight, it has a depth and luminosity that everyone admires. The green comes from a pigment called Paris green, also known as Schweinfurt green, or Scheele's green in its earlier formulation. It is a compound of copper and arsenic, specifically copper acetoarsenite, that produces when applied to wallpaper or paint or fabric or anything that will take a dye, a colour of truly remarkable intensity and range. It is also at sufficient exposure toxic. This is not a secret exactly. There have been papers about it in medical journals since the 1830s. There was a fuss in 1861 when the Lancet published on the subject. There are people in the medical establishment who know about it. The wallpaper manufacturers on the whole contest the evidence. The colour sellers definitely contest the evidence. It is one of those facts that exists in the world without yet having been converted into the kind of action that protects the people at risk. The people at risk in houses like this are primarily the children who spend the most time in decorated rooms and the servants who clean those rooms. The green pigment releases arsenic vapour over time, more in damp conditions, more in heat, more when the paper is disturbed, when dust is raised by cleaning, when pieces of wallpaper are torn and reglued, when the walls are wiped down with a damp cloth. You will be asked to wipe down the drawing room walls in February when a damp patch appears near the skirting board and needs to be addressed before it spreads. You will do this with a cloth and warm water working in sections, and the green pigment will smear slightly on the cloth and come off green, and you will think, that's the pigment, that's expected. Your head will feel odd by the end of the room. You will put this down to the turpentine you used earlier that morning on the kitchen floor. You won't connect it to the wallpaper. Nobody tells you to connect it to the wallpaper. Mrs. Collins doesn't know. Mrs. Hartley doesn't know. Mrs. Pemberton, who chose the colour, has seen nothing in the newspapers she reads that would have told her. The knowledge that would protect you exists somewhere in the world. In scientific journals and medical reports and the private deliberations of manufacturers' lawyers. It has simply not yet made the journey to the cleaning cloth in your hand. By spring you'll have had 3 unexplained headaches, and once in the drawing room a brief and alarming nausea that passed quickly enough for you to dismiss it. You'll chalk all of this up to the fumes from the range or the cold or perhaps the water. It won't be those things. But you won't know that, and it won't be enough to make you properly sick. Not like some people, not like the children in documented cases in houses, where the paper was worse or the rooms were smaller or the ventilation was worse. Just the subclinical trickle that leaves no clear evidence of itself. The house contains dangers it doesn't know it contains. You inhabit those dangers. You work among them and clean around them and breathe the air in which they're suspended, and the arrangement is so normal that the abnormality of it is invisible. This is the other meaning of the invisible servant. You absorb things the house produces, the heat, the labour, the chemicals. The cost of all of it is paid in your body, quietly, over time, 3 weeks in. The burn has healed to a scar I can describe with the precision of someone who looked at it frequently. A pale oval about an inch long, slightly shinier than the surrounding skin, raised just perceptibly at the edges. You stop noticing it as a burn and start noticing it as just part of your forearm. Your hands are harder, the cracks in your knuckles have mostly closed. You move through the kitchen faster, with less conscious navigation, with a growing instinct for the geography of it. Mrs. Hartley has started you on basic pastry work. Not the good pastry, not the short crust for the family's pie, not the rough puff that goes on the game dishes, but the practice pastry, the batch you make 3 times a week from cheaper flour and old butter. Learning the technique without wasting good ingredients on mistakes. Pastry technique, it turns out, is almost entirely about temperature and touch. The butter has to be cold enough that it has resistance, that when you break it into the flour with your fingertips it stays in distinct pieces rather than melting into the mix. Your fingertips are the thermometer. You learn to wash your hands in cold water before starting and to work quickly, to keep the contact brief, to process the butter in as few movements as possible. Your hands, which have been warm all morning from the range work, from the coal scuttles, from the washing, are too warm for pastry. You learn to plunge them in cold water, the scullery sink, not quite numbing them but dropping their temperature enough to work with. You learn to work fast. The first 3 attempts, a dough that was too warm came together into a greasy mass instead of the sandy crumble you were aiming for. A dough that was right but was overworked came out tough instead of tender. A dough that was both cold enough and handled correctly, but you were nervous and your hands were shaking slightly, which you could feel in the texture. The 4th attempt, something right happened. The butter broke down into small pieces through the flour, each one coated and separate, and when you added the water, cold just enough, the dough came together in a way that felt different from before, coherent but not pressed, together without being worked. You wrapped it in a cloth and left it in the cold larder for 30 minutes, the way Mrs. Hartley had shown you. When you took it out and rolled it, it rolled. Mrs. Hartley examined the result without touching it. She looked at the cut edge where the pastry had been trimmed. She picked it up and held it briefly, turning it over. "Better," she said, and put it down and walked away. It was the most validation she had offered since your first week's negotiation with the greengrocer, when she had said the delivery was correctly unpacked, which had felt, in context, like high praise. Better. You folded the information away and went back to the range. There are 4 other servants in the house, apart from you and Lizzie and Mrs. Hartley. Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, a small, dry, precise woman of 50-something who manages the household accounts and the upper servants and the ordering of all supplies and communicates with the kitchen through a combination of written notes and brief, direct, verbal instructions. She and Mrs. Hartley have a relationship of mutual professional respect and mutual professional surveillance, each aware that the other's domain borders on their own. They do not quarrel. Quarrelling would be inefficient. But there is a precision about the boundary between kitchen authority and household authority that both of them maintain like a property line. Jane, the parlour maid, 23, originally from somewhere in Cheshire, has been in service since she was 17, and knows exactly how to lay a table for 12 and how to carry a tray without spilling anything on the main staircase, and how to be present in a room without appearing to be present. She has a kind of effortless competence at her own job that you find simultaneously reassuring and slightly intimidating. She comes to the kitchen for the serving dishes but has no jurisdiction here, and she knows it, and Mrs. Hartley knows she knows it. Thomas the footman, young, tall, presented in a livery that is considerably more expensive than anything you own, and that he is required to maintain perfectly at his own expense, which seems to you like a significant detail. His job involves primarily carrying things, answering the door, waiting at table, and being decorative in a way that requires a height above 5'9" and a face that doesn't actively alarm the guests. He is pleasant and somewhat vacant, and extremely good at the carrying things, and Miss Reed, the lady's maid, 30 sharp, serving Mrs. Pemberton exclusively, with an intimate access to the family that puts her in a different social position from the other servants, more and less simultaneously. She knows things about the family that nobody else knows. She goes places the family goes. She's trusted with their bodies and their wardrobes and their private letters, and this trust both elevates her and isolates her. She eats with the upper servants, but not the lower servants, and holds herself in a way that communicates this distinction at all times. You're at the bottom of this structure. Lizzie is below you in the scullery, which means there is technically someone lower, someone whose work is less skilled, whose status is smaller, whose wage is less. And this is its own strange instruction in how hierarchies work. You are near the bottom, but you are not the bottom. And the bottom is only 13 years old, and from the East End, and washes everything that comes down to her, and asks nothing of anyone, and goes to sleep exhausted on a Sunday evening, in a small room off the scullery, where the walls are perpetually damp. The servants' hall is where you eat, all of you below stairs, at a long table that seats 8. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 1, after the family's luncheon is served, supper at 8, or when the work allows. The food is what's left from the kitchen, which is generally adequate and occasionally very good. When there's a formal dinner and there are proper leftovers, the servants eat considerably better than usual. The hierarchy of the table mirrors the hierarchy of the house. Mrs. Collins at the head, Mrs. Hartley beside her, then the upper servants, then you and Lizzie at the far end. At the far end you hear the conversations from the other end as a murmur. Sometimes Jane or Thomas will say something that carries about the family's plans for the weekend, about a guest who's coming to dinner, about a letter that arrived and who it was from, and you absorb this information without acknowledging that you're absorbing it. The below-stairs world runs on information, on knowing things, on the accumulated intelligence of people who are present in rooms without being visible. You learn the family is comfortable, but not excessively wealthy. Mr. Pemberton is in trade, import and export of something. The details are vague and held above your grade, and has done well enough for this house in Chelsea, but a Mayfair house would have stretched him. Mrs. Pemberton's family is better connected than her husband's. She brings to the marriage a certain social currency that he lacks. Their dinners are about this in part, maintaining the connection she brought. The children are boarding school and will return at Easter. There are weekly allowances for coal, for kitchen supplies, for laundry. Mrs. Hartley manages the kitchen budget with a precision that tells you this is not an area of generosity. Every penny of meat, every quarter-pound of butter, every fire log is accounted for in the ledger she keeps on the shelf above the dresser. When there is a formal dinner, the budget expands, and the kitchen becomes a different kind of operation. More ingredients, more preparation, more complexity. The whole machinery shifted into a higher gear. Your first formal dinner happens at the end of January. 6 guests, 8 at table total, 3 courses before the main, a main with 3 removes, 2 puddings, a savoury to finish, cheese and fruit after that if requested, coffee in the drawing room. The preparation begins 2 days before. You're responsible for the stock, which you make under Mrs. Hartley's supervision and which takes an entire day. The vegetable work for all courses, which takes most of another day. The pastry work for the savoury cases, which you make 3 times before getting a batch that Mrs. Hartley approves, and the constant maintenance of the range at working temperature through all of it. The coal work, the cleaning, the mechanical support that makes everything else possible. On the day itself, the kitchen is not large enough for what's happening. Every surface in use. The range running at full capacity. All 4 trivets occupied, both ovens working, the warming oven holding the plates, the boiler keeping the hot water coming. Mrs. Hartley moving between stations with a speed that seems impossible given the constraints of the space, tasting, adjusting, directing, her voice at a level above its usual register but not raised, just closer to the edge. Stock. You bring the stock. Reduce this. She points to a sauce. You reduce it, watching the surface, judging the viscosity. Stop now. You stop. The first course goes up at 7:35. Jane carries it. The dumbwaiter takes the empty dishes back down. You wash them immediately because the space needs the space. Second course up at 8:10. Third at past. The main at 9. The main is a roast, a saddle of lamb, which Mrs. Hartley has been preparing since morning, which has been sitting in the warming oven for the exact period of time required to keep it at temperature without overcooking, which is a judgment she makes without a thermometer, which she makes with her hand held flat above the surface of the meat at a distance of 2 inches. Is it right? You ask once, leaning to see. She doesn't look at you. Feel the difference between this and your own hand's heat, she says. Learn to read it. You hold your hand at the same distance. You feel warmth, steady and dry, radiating up. You try to hold the sensation. You try to remember it as data. You won't be able to reproduce it for months, but you're beginning to understand what you're learning toward. The saddle goes up. It comes back empty, which means the family is pleased, which means the evening is going well. Mrs. Hartley's expression doesn't change, but her movements ease slightly. The final pressure lifts fractionally. Puddings, savoury, clean down. At 10:30, the family's in the drawing room with coffee, and the kitchen is quiet for the first time in 3 days. Mrs. Hartley sits on the stool she has in the corner, the only seating in the working kitchen, and drinks a cup of tea. You are washing the last of the copper pots in the scullery. Your back aches in a specific way that tells you you've been leaning over surfaces for approximately 12 hours. You can hear your heartbeat in your palms. Lizzie is somewhere nearby, moving quietly, dealing with something. The scrape of a metal scrubbing brush on stone. Mrs. Hartley's voice from the kitchen, not raised, just present. Agnes. You put down the pot. You went to the doorway. She was looking at the range, which needed attention. The fire was lower than it should be for the overnight bank. She was holding her tea. You kept up, she said. You had learned by this point to understand Mrs. Hartley's vocabulary. Kept up meant you were where you needed to be at each stage. You didn't cause problems. In a dinner like this, with this complexity, a kitchen maid who falls behind creates a chain of failures. You didn't fall behind. Thank you, you said. She turned back to the range. She drank her tea. Go add coal to the box, she said, then you're done. You went to add coal to the box. You were done. February brought cold of a different character than January. January had been grey and wet. February came in dry and severe, a freeze that locked the stone streets and made the pavement in front of number 14 look like hammered iron. And that turned the water in your washing basin. before you broke it with your fist in the morning into a plate of solid ice 1/2 inch thick. The range was the warmest room in the house, the warmest room in many houses in this street, in this neighbourhood, in this city. Coal burning from 5 in the morning until past 10 at night, 7 days a week, February and through winter, and into what would eventually become spring, generating the heat that moved upward through the house in the form of hot water and heated rooms, and the indirect warmth of a building whose centre was burning. In the kitchen, this warmth was immediate and total. You worked in your dress and apron, and you were comfortable in a way that stopped occurring to you as comfort because it was constant. The scullery was another matter. The scullery had no range heat. The single window let cold in continuously. The water from the pump was, in February, cold enough that your hands stopped functioning normally within about 5 minutes of sustained exposure. You wore nothing on your hands, nothing was practical, and gloves were not a thing that was provided, and your own gloves were kept for Sundays. So you worked with bare hands in cold water and the cold worked its way in. Chilblains. If you have never had chilblains, here is what they are. A vascular reaction to repeated cold exposure, producing swelling and itching and redness in the fingers and toes and ears, specifically at the places where small blood vessels constrict in the cold and then dilate suddenly on rewarming. The itching is profound. It is the kind of itch that doesn't go away when you scratch it, that in fact becomes worse when you scratch it, that has a particular quality of futility. Scratching this itch is impossible, like trying to catch water in your hands, and the attempt produces only more sensation without relief. Your hands at night, warmed by the kitchen air, were constantly itching. You slept with them under your pillow, which was cooler than the ambient air, which helped slightly. By morning they'd calmed. By noon, after 3 hours in the scullery, they'd started again. This is the alternation, cold and heat, over and over every day, the circulation in your fingers performing this loop that was never intended and for which the body has no good adaptation. By March, your hands would be something other than what they were when you arrived. Not ruined. You wouldn't lose sensation. You wouldn't get the permanent damage that some servants got after years of this, but marked. Different. The small price of the work accumulated in the flesh. Lizzie had them worse. Her hands were in cold water longer. The scullery was her primary domain in a way that it wasn't yet yours, and by February she had bright red patches on all 10 fingers and on the back of both hands that looked, when she showed them to you one evening, like something that should be under a doctor's care. Does Mrs. Hartley know? I showed her in January. She gave me the goose fat. And, Lizzie shrugged. The shrug said, and nothing. What would knowing change? The dishes need washing. The scullery is cold. The circulation in my hands makes bad decisions. The work continues. You remembered something your mother said before you left, which you hadn't understood then. Your body will keep score. She'd said it in reference to something else, to carrying things to heavy work, but you were beginning to understand it in a more comprehensive way. The body keeps score. The burns, the chilblains, the soda crystals, the coal dust in the lungs, the ache in the back after a dinner service, the permanent warmth of your palm from years of holding a hot pot handle. These were the body's ledger, the accounting of what the work costs. The work cost. You knew that going in theory. You are learning it in practice, and you stay. Because what else? Because this is the thing you have, and it feeds you and houses you and pays you and teaches you a trade, and the burns and the chilblains are the price of that. And the price seems, on most days in your current assessment with your current information, acceptable. On the days it doesn't seem acceptable, you wash your hands with the goose fat and go to sleep and wake up the next morning and light the fire and start again. The body keeps score. You keep going. In the 3rd week of February, Mrs. Hartley told you something directly about herself. This was unusual enough that you registered it as such immediately. You were working the pastry together. She was teaching you rough puff, which is a faster approximation of full puff pastry, useful for specific applications where the texture and rise matter, but the time required for full lamination doesn't exist. The technique involves folding and rolling, building thin layers of butter within the dough that will, in the oven's heat, produce the characteristic flake. Your hands had gotten warm from the work. She noticed. She always noticed, and said, without stopping her own rolling, "Cold water, now." You went to the scullery pump. You came back with cold hands. "My mother's kitchen," she said when you returned. She didn't look up from the pastry. "She made pies, good ones. The whole village said so. I used to watch her do exactly this, the folding, and I thought it was magic. I thought she was doing something impossible, that the butter was somehow going into the dough without being inside it." You stood at your end of the work table waiting. "I was 13 when I started in service, scullery maid at a house outside Shrewsbury. The cook there was a woman named Mrs. Farrow, not like my mother. She was precise, scientific about it. She could explain the mechanism of every technique, why the butter has to be cold, what happens to the layers in the oven. It wasn't magic when she explained it. It was cause and effect." She completed a fold. She looked at your section. "Too wide, narrower," you corrected. "But it was still difficult," she said. "Knowing the mechanism doesn't make your hands know it. You have to teach your hands separately. That takes years." She folded again. "When did you get it?" you asked. "When did your hands know it?" She was quiet for a moment. "3rd year of my apprenticeship. Mrs. Farrow gave me a batch to do alone, without watching. I did it correctly. I knew it was correct before I even checked, because I could feel it in the dough." She paused. "That feeling doesn't come until it comes. You can't force it. You can only do the work until it does." She turned the dough, she rolled. "You're faster than you were," she said. "This was not warmth. It was assessment. Your instincts for the range are improving. You wasted less coal last week than the week before. Your vegetable work is consistent." A brief pause. "The pastry will come." You folded your section of dough. You felt in it the slight resistance of the butter layers, the faint texture of the lamination beginning. You couldn't feel that it was correct yet, but you could feel that it was different from when you started. You could feel the beginning of an ability to read it. That felt like something. Late February. A Wednesday evening, the family out for dinner elsewhere, the kitchen quiet by 7 in the way it only was when there was no dinner service to prepare for. Mrs. Hartley had retired early. She did this sometimes on evenings when the work permitted. A woman who banked her rest with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. You were in the kitchen alone, finishing the range maintenance for the night. This was your task. Bank the fire. Reduce it to a controlled, slow burn that would keep the range warm through the night without consuming excessive coal, and clean the surfaces and secure the kitchen for the night. Latches, the coal hole hatch, the scullery window, the gas lamp above the work table. You turned it down until the flame was barely present, a small blue point in the mantle. You didn't turn it off fully. because the range fire needed enough light to read if you came down in the night, and because a fully dark kitchen in a house this size had a quality you hadn't fully made peace with yet. You stood for a moment, the range ticking as the metal adjusted to the slightly lower temperature. The banked fire a deep red glow visible through the firebox vents, the copper pots on their hooks throwing small reflections of the firelight, the smell of the kitchen at rest, not the active smell of cooking but the residual warm, slightly woody smell of a room that has been burning coal and preparing food all day, and has been given permission for a few hours to simply exist. You had been here 6 weeks. This kitchen, in 6 weeks, had become a place you knew in your body the way you knew your body itself. The temperature at each point of the range, the particular resistance of the scullery pump handle, the way the floor in the corner near the coal hole was always slightly damp, always, no matter how many times you dried it. The exact height of the step up from the scullery to the kitchen, which you had stopped consciously accounting for and now navigated automatically. Your mother's kitchen in Harrietsham, the small scrub table, the blackened kettle, the warmth from the range that was half the size of this one, was becoming a memory rather than a reference. The texture of it receding slightly, the specific smell getting harder to hold, the way the light came through that particular window becoming less precise as the days accumulated. This kitchen was becoming the kitchen. Your kitchen. The one you moved through, automatically, the one your body understood. You weren't sure how you felt about that. Lizzie appeared from the scullery doorway. She was carrying a mug of something, tea from the smell of it. She set it on the work table and went back for another and brought it out. She handed you one, you took it. Ration, she said. There's enough for tonight. You knew she meant the tea was from the kitchen store, which, strictly speaking, was not for the kitchen maid's evening cup without permission, but which Mrs. Hartley had also never explicitly prohibited, which in the kitchen's unwritten rules occupied a zone of tacit permission. You drank the tea. It was hot and dark and had a bitterness you'd grown to associate with the end of the working day. Lizzie sat on the step between the scullery and the kitchen. She often sat there. It was a kind of neutral zone, and held her mug in both hands, looking at the range. "How long are you staying?" she asked. The question surprised you, not because it was unusual, but because it assumed a time horizon you hadn't exactly been thinking in. "Until my apprenticeship is done," you said. Mrs. Hartley said 3 to 5 years before I might have a kitchen maid's reference for a better position. What's better? Larger house, probably. Higher wage. Maybe cook general in a smaller house. Lizzie nodded. She was thinking about something. "I'm going to try to be a cook," she said, as if saying it out loud was itself a kind of decision. "You'd be good at it," you said. She had a feel for food. You'd noticed it in small ways, in the way she tasted things when given the chance, in the questions she asked Mrs. Hartley, which were always the right questions. "It'll take forever." Everything takes forever. She looked at her hands around the mug, the chilblain redness. "I'm going to have these forever too," she said. "Probably. My mum had them. She was a laundress." You thought about that. Chilblains as inheritance. The body keeping score in the same place across generations. "Mine too," you said, though your mother had been in service, not laundering. Hands. You both drank your tea. The range ticked. Outside, somewhere in the frozen street, a cart passed, the horse's hooves on the iron-cold pavement ringing with a clarity that was almost musical in the still night air. You thought, this is what it is for now. This kitchen, this hour, this mug of borrowed tea at the end of a working day, Lizzie on her step. The range banked for the night. The city going about its business somewhere up there, above the barred window, above the area steps, above the whole below-ground world that makes the above-ground world possible. You were here. You were warm enough. You were learning. Tomorrow there would be the coal, and the range, and the pastry practice, and the soup, and the vegetables, and all the rest of it. The same as today, the same as yesterday, the same as the days stretching forward into whatever you were becoming. But tonight, for 20 minutes, there was just the tea. March. Something changed in March. Not dramatically. Not a single moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it shifted. But there was a week, maybe 10 days, when you noticed that the work felt different. Less like decoding and more like doing. Less like consulting a mental map and more like simply moving through a space you knew. You could feel it in specific ways. The coal. You were doing it faster. 3 trips down and up the coal hole in the time it used to take you 4. Your body had figured out the most efficient angles of movement in the restricted space. How to turn at the bottom, how to hold the bucket to distribute the weight, how to carry it up without stopping. You hadn't consciously decided to be more efficient. Your body had decided on its own without consulting you. The range. You could hear things in it now. The specific quality of the draft that told you the firebox needed adjusting. The sound the water made in the boiler when it was approaching pressure. The particular crack of the metal that meant the temperature had hit working heat. These sounds were data. They had always been data. But before, you heard them as noise. Background information without meaning. Now they were language. The pastry. Still not quite, but closer. You felt the dough differently. The moment when it had the right amount of water, the right amount of cohesion. You were beginning to be able to find that moment by touch rather than by guessing. Not consistently, but sometimes. Mrs. Hartley noticed. She noticed in the way she noticed everything. She said nothing, but the quality of her instructions changed. Less explaining, more directing. She told you what to do rather than how to do it, which meant she trusted that you knew how. Reduce the stock. Make the pastry for the pie. The range wants attention. These were the instructions of someone who believed you understood the underlying competence. Before, she would have said, reduce the stock by half, watch the surface, stir occasionally. Now she said, reduce the stock, and you reduced it correctly, or mostly correctly, and when you didn't, she caught it before it became a problem and you corrected. That was its own kind of learning. The space to be trusted with the task. The room to make small errors and correct them. Lizzie was watching this. You could feel her watching it. Not with resentment. Lizzie didn't seem to operate in resentment, which you admired. But with the attention of someone cataloguing useful information about a process she was working toward. How do you know when the stock is right? She asked once, late in the evening, after Mrs. Hartley had gone up. These smell changes, you said, which surprised you by being true. When it's reducing properly, you get this. You paused, trying to find the word. It intensifies. You can smell the depth of it starting to concentrate. Lizzie thought about this. How do you know what that smells like until you've smelled it? You learn it by getting it wrong first. The first time I reduced stock, I went too far. It got syrupy and Mrs. Hartley had me redo the whole batch. But I knew the smell that went with too far, and everything before that smell is approaching right. Lizzie nodded, filing this. She was always filing. That's how she teaches, she said. Backwards. You thought about that. From the wrong thing, yes. My last job taught me the same way, Lizzie said. except by shouting. That's different. It's faster, she said dryly, not better. She picked up her scrubbing brush. Go the wrong way at full volume. Your body learns it faster just to shut up the shouting. You thought about the burnt arm, the scalded hand, Mrs. Hartley's voice, not for any reason. The lesson landing cleanly, without volume, because the moment contained the instruction. 2 different pedagogies, the same destination, a body that knew how not to hurt itself. Late March, a Saturday, the end of the week, the family away at a relation's house in the country for the weekend, the house in a state of relative quiet that had a particular texture to it, less pressure, less precision, the machinery at idle speed. Mrs. Hartley announced after the midday meal that she had an errand in the afternoon and would be returning at 5. Mrs. Collins was supervising the airing of the upstairs rooms, which occupied Jane and Thomas. Lizzie had the laundry. The kitchen was yours, not entirely yours. You didn't have authority over anything. There were no decisions to make, and the basic tasks of the afternoon continued regardless. Coal, cleaning, the soup stock, preparation for Sunday's cold lunch, which was simpler than a full dinner service. But you were the senior person in the kitchen. The range was yours to manage. The kitchen's basic function was in your hands. This had happened twice before, briefly, but not for an entire afternoon. You stood in the kitchen for a moment after Mrs. Hartley left, just standing, letting the fact of it settle. Then you went to work. The coal, first. The range needed its afternoon feed. Down the hatch, fill the bucket, carry up. 3 trips. The familiar sequence. Back in the kitchen, you opened the firebox and assessed the fire. You added coal in the way you'd been shown, small pieces on top, angled to fall into the gaps, not flooding, building a structure that would burn evenly. You adjusted the damper. You waited, watching through the firebox door until you saw the new coal catch and the temperature begin to rise again. You moved to the work table. The vegetables for tomorrow's cold lunch needed to be ready. Potatoes boiled and dressed. The beet dressed with vinegar. The green beans blanched and chilled. You began. The potatoes first because they took longest. Into the pot with salted water. Onto the front trivet. Medium heat. You adjusted the damper. Felt the range's response in the quality of sound from the firebox. While the potatoes came to the boil, you started the beans. Topped and tailed, the snap of each one clean and satisfying. The green smell of them, fresh, a smell that still had something country about it, something of open-air growing. The potatoes came to the boil. You reduced them. In the scullery you could hear Lizzie working the copper, the heavy slosh of wet fabric, the creak of the wringer handle. The kitchen was full of the smell of cooking, potatoes and the underlying warmth of the range, and the stock on the back trivet, which had been going since Monday, and which was darker and deeper every day, moving toward a richness that was almost mahogany. You worked. The afternoon passed in the way afternoons did when you were working alone and the work was clear. In chunks of focused attention, one task at a time, each task bounded by its own logic, each completing and releasing you to the next. By the time Mrs. Hartley returned at 5:05, 4 minutes late, which she noted with a slight compression of her lips, the cold lunch was prepared, and chilling in the larder. The kitchen was clean, the range was at correct overnight temperature, and the Sunday morning tasks were prepped and waiting. She moved through the kitchen. She examined the larder. She checked the range temperature with her hand above the firebox. She looked at the stock. She said nothing for a moment. Then, good. One word. You had been in this kitchen for 3 months and you were learning that Mrs. Hartley's one-word assessments were the currency of the kitchen, and that good was the one worth having, and that you had just spent an afternoon learning the thing that apprenticeships are actually about, which is not technique but the application of technique without supervision. You had run the kitchen for an afternoon. You had not burned anything. You had not set anything on fire. You had not scalded yourself or anyone else. The food was correct and the range was correct and the kitchen was ready for tomorrow. You were learning to be a cook. Not there yet. Not even close, really, when you compared yourself to Mrs. Hartley and her 20-year head start. But the direction was established. The path was visible. That was enough. For today, that was enough. April, Easter week, and Master Charles and Miss Harriet came home from school. The house changed. You'd heard about it from Jane and from Mrs. Collins' instructions, which multiplied in frequency and specificity as the holiday approached. The day nursery to be opened and aired, the children's rooms freshened, additional supplies ordered, the timetable adjusted to accommodate meals at different hours and different quantities. Master Charles was 12. Miss Harriet was 9. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a hansom cab with a great deal of luggage and noise, and the particular energy of children released from institutional structure. You heard them from the kitchen, the front door, the voices, Mrs. Pemberton's greeting, the higher-pitched responses, feet on the main stairs, and then, about 40 minutes later, Miss Harriet appeared in the kitchen doorway. This was not expected. Children of the family did not visit the kitchen. There was no formal rule against it, unlike the more rigid Victorian households where below stairs was entirely invisible to the family. But it also simply wasn't done in the normal course of things. Mrs. Pemberton had her own relationship with Mrs. Hartley through the medium of menus, which were presented each morning and amended by mutual agreement, but Mrs. Pemberton herself rarely came below stairs. Miss Harriet was 9, and evidently had not fully internalized this protocol, or had and was testing it. She stood in the doorway in a white pinafore and regarded the kitchen with the focused attention of someone cataloguing new information. "What are you making?" she asked. "You were making stock additions, adding the parsley stems from today's vegetables, and you were so startled that you answered before you thought about it. The soup stock, miss." She came further in. Not all the way. She stopped at the edge of the work table, maintaining a kind of observational perimeter. "It smells like Sunday," she said. "You thought about this." "Chicken bones, miss, and vegetables." "It smells like cook's kitchen at my grandmother's." She was looking at the range with the curiosity of someone who had seen this object before but never up close. "Is that the range?" "Yes, miss." "Jane says the range can cook a whole dinner at once." "Mrs. Hartley can, yes." She looked at you. "Have you been burned?" The question was direct and without preamble in the way that children's questions were. "Yes, miss," you said. "Does it hurt when it happens?" "Yes." "Does it hurt now?" You showed her the scar on your forearm, the oldest one, the first one, now fully healed and pale. "No, not now." She examined it with serious attention. "My brother got a burn from a poker at school last term. He cried." "Most people do," you said. "It's quite reasonable." She seemed to consider this. "Mother says servants don't feel pain the way normal people do." There was a silence. In it, you were aware of several things simultaneously. The ranger's temperature, correct. The stock, fine. The question of how to respond to what you'd just heard, which was the kind of thing that, if handled incorrectly in either direction, either acquiescing to an untruth or causing offence, could produce consequences you weren't equipped to manage. Your mother may have meant something different, you said carefully. I expect she meant that servants learn to work through pain rather than stopping. That's true. We do. Miss Harriet thought about this with the serious concentration of a child attempting to reconcile two things that didn't fit together. But you do feel it. Yes, miss, same as anyone. She looked at the scar again. She looked at you. That seems unfair, she said. Many things are, miss. You said it quietly and without emphasis, the way you would state a fact, the kind of fact that is so thoroughly true that it doesn't require a tone. She stood there for another moment, and then Mrs. Collins appeared in the doorway behind her with the particular expression of someone who has just discovered a household boundary being accidentally tested. Miss Harriet, your mother is looking for you. Miss Harriet straightened up. The 9-year-old composure of someone who has been caught, but intends to leave with dignity. Thank you for showing me, she said to you quite formally. Of course, miss, you said. She left. Mrs. Collins looked at you for a moment, a look that was assessing something, though exactly what you weren't sure, and then left too. You turned back to the stock. The range was burning. The stock was developing. The kitchen smelled of Sunday, the way the girl said. You stirred the pot 3 times around, then across, the proper way, your hands in the steam, warm, rough-ended, tinted, slightly grey at the creases. Your hands as they were now, 3 months in, your hands keeping score. Many things are unfair, miss. You went back to work. The Easter holiday brought a different rhythm. The children's meals, lighter, simpler, at different hours, folded into the existing schedule with less difficulty than you'd expected. Partly because Mrs. Hartley had been doing this for several years, and had the adjustment pre-calculated, and partly because Charles and Harriet were, by the standards of the household, relatively uncomplicated eaters. Charles wanted meat. Harriet wanted puddings. Both wanted bread at almost all times. These were manageable requirements. But the house was louder, fuller. The energy of children occupied space in a way that adult occupancy didn't quite. Feet on the stairs at unexpected hours, voices rising from the schoolroom, the occasional crash that sent Jane or Mrs. Collins moving quickly. In the kitchen you barely saw them. Once Charles put his head through the area door to ask if there were any biscuits. There weren't, and Mrs. Hartley told him so without looking up from the sauce she was working. And that was essentially the extent of his relationship with the kitchen. Miss Harriet didn't return, but she sent something down via Jane on the Thursday of Easter week. A note. Jane delivered it to Mrs. Hartley with a slightly baffled expression, a folded piece of paper with "For the kitchen maid" written on it in a child's handwriting. Mrs. Hartley looked at it. She looked at you. She handed it to you. You opened it. It said, "I have thought about what you said. I think you're right. I am sorry about your arm." It was signed H. Pemberton. You looked at it for a moment. You folded it and put it in your apron pocket. You went back to work. You still have the note. You have kept it in your tin trunk under the spare apron since April. You don't know why exactly. It seems like the kind of thing that should be kept. 9 years old. Capable of reconsidering a thing she'd been told. Capable of saying sorry to someone below her in a household that didn't require it. That was something. It wasn't enough to change anything structural, but it was something. Many things are unfair, miss, and some children notice. The days lengthened. The light through the barred window lasted longer, reaching into the kitchen now in the late afternoons in a way it hadn't in January. laying a stripe of gold across the work table for an hour before it angled away. You noticed this. You noticed it particularly because you'd spent the winter months in what felt like permanent below-ground dark, and the return of light had the quality of something retrieved. The cold larder was less necessary. The ice in the cooling box in the scullery, which had to be replenished from the iceman's delivery every 3 days through the winter, was replenished less often. The stone walls stopped perspiring quite so aggressively. The coal consumption dropped, and with it the coal runs, and your hands had 3 fewer trips down the hatch per day, which was a small but real improvement. Spring in a kitchen, the lightening of the range, the season's new vegetables arriving in Sid's crates, asparagus in late April, which was a revelation, the first bundles of it going up to the family's table in white paper and coming down as stems to be used in the stock, new potatoes, sorrel from the greengrocer's hothouse, the first of the season's lettuces, Mrs. Hartley teaching you a salad dressing, emulsification, the science of it, the mustard as emulsifier, the oil added slowly, the way the mixture changed texture at the point of stability. "Watch for the shift," she said, pouring oil in a thin thread while you worked the bowl. "You'll see it happen. Everything before it is sauce, everything after is dressing. The moment is quick." You watched. You worked. And there, at some point in the middle of the pour, something changed. The mixture thickened, unified, went from the loose and separated to the coherent and smooth. "There," Mrs. Hartley said. "That's it." You could feel it in the spoon. The resistance was different. The mixture pulling against the stroke with a new weight, a new structure. "Again?" you asked. She made a new bowl. You did it again, and again. By the 4th time you could tell by feel, by the quality of resistance in the spoon, approximately when the shift was going to happen. You could feel it coming. Not predict it precisely, not control it entirely, but anticipate it. Be ready. Your body learning. Separate from you. Faster than you sometimes. May. The household had settled into its warm weather rhythm. The family's social calendar accelerating with the season. More dinners, more visitors, and on 3 occasions a proper dinner party of more than 8, which required the kitchen to operate at its maximum capacity, and which left you, on the evening after the last course was cleared, sitting on the scullery step with your legs straight out in front of you and your back against the wall, too tired to move immediately. Lizzie sat next to you, same position. 3 down, she said. How many to go? The season runs until July. Could be more. Wonderful. She had a cup of water, cold, not tea, too tired for the effort of the tea, and handed it to you when she was done. You drank the rest of it. I made the sauce tonight, you said. This required context. A cream sauce, which had been your responsibility for the first time, which Mrs. Hartley had started and left for you to finish and monitor while she was attending to the main, and which had to arrive at the right consistency at exactly the right moment to be sent up. It had arrived at the right consistency at exactly the right moment. She didn't say anything, you added. She wouldn't, Lizzie said. Did it go up? Yes. Did it come back wrong? No. Then she's not saying anything because it was correct. You thought about this. The logic of the kitchen, the absence of correction as its own form of praise. When does it stop feeling like luck, you asked. Lizzie looked at the ceiling of the scullery. She thought about it properly. I don't know, she said. I've been doing the copper for 8 months, and it still feels like luck when nothing goes wrong. That's different. Nothing going wrong with the copper is partly luck because the equipment, I know, but also, she paused, maybe the luck feeling goes away the same time the fear goes away, and maybe the fear never fully goes away. And that keeps you careful. You thought about the source. You thought about the moment when the cream began to thicken, the same kind of moment as the salad dressing, the same quality of shift from one state to another, and the focus that was required, the complete attention, the range of small adjustments that held it at correct. Fear as attention, attention as skill. Maybe that was how it worked. Mrs. Hartley's afraid, you said. I think Mrs. Hartley's afraid every dinner service, Lizzie said. She's just had 30 years to make it look like something else. You lay your head back against the wall. The scullery was cold still, even in May. The stone held its cold through the seasons, and the cold against your back was good after the kitchen's heat. Tomorrow the family was eating at a friend's house, and the kitchen would be on minimum operation. You would have a half day. You were going to go to the embankment again. You were going to sit on the bench by the river and eat a penny bun and do nothing for 20 minutes. And this time, you were going to look at the Albert Bridge and let yourself feel genuinely proud of the source. Not for long, not more than a moment. Pride was something you spent carefully, the way you spent money, at the end of a particular achievement, briefly, and then put away. But tonight, in the scullery, with your back against the cold stone and the range ticking through the wall, you were a kitchen maid who had made a correct sauce under pressure, in a formal dinner, without supervision, for the first time. That was real. That had happened. The body scored it, and so did you. Your arm under your rolled sleeve had a scar you'd stopped looking at. Your hands were harder than they were when you came here. Your lungs had coal in them, a little. The chilblains had faded with the spring and would come back with the winter. You were 4 months in. You had your pastry and your stock and your sauce and your instincts for the range. You'd learned to read the fire and the dough and the reduction and the particular silence of the kitchen at rest. You were learning slowly and with the assistance of small failures how this place worked and what it asked of you and what it was capable of producing when it was managed right. The range was not trying to kill you. The copper was not trying to kill you. The washing soda and the carbolic and the arsenic in the green walls were not trying to kill you. They were simply what they were, and what they were was dangerous. And the only response was knowledge and habit and the slow accumulation of care. You were building that. One morning's early fire at a time, one Burns lesson at a time, one correct sauce at a time. You would be here for years. You would learn to make the good pastry and the full puff, and eventually the complicated things, the raised pies, the glazed tarts, the soufflés that Mrs. Hartley could produce but hadn't yet taught you because you weren't ready, and by the time you were ready you would probably not feel ready, because readiness has that quality. It sneaks up behind you while you're still calling yourself unprepared. But that's years from now. That's the future. Tonight, there is the scullery and the cold wall and the tired feet, and the girl next to you who wants to be a cook someday too, who has chilblains and a future ahead of her that she cannot yet see clearly. Tonight, there is just this. June. The kitchen in summer heat was its own particular challenge. The range that had been your warmth all winter was by June an adversary. 20 feet of kitchen, one window facing north, and a 600-pound iron furnace burning continuously at its centre. The temperature by mid-morning was genuinely punishing. You stripped down to your lightest cotton, the summer dress, thin blue print, shorter sleeves, which exposed the scar but also let your arms breathe. And you worked in the heat the way you worked in everything else, by adapting. by finding the angles and positions where the range's heat was slightly less direct, by timing the work at the firebox, coal additions, damper adjustments, for the coolest moments, the early morning, the late evening. The Iceman's deliveries increased. The larder became crucial again, not for cold protection but for food safety. Summer heat in a kitchen moved things towards spoilage faster, and Mrs. Hartley's eye for freshness, already exact, became sharper, her inspection of deliveries more demanding. "Smell this," she said one morning, holding the cream jug toward you. You smelled it. You thought, fine, slightly warm, nothing wrong. She watched you. "Again," she said. You smelled it again, longer this time, with more attention. There was something, under the dairy clean smell of good cream, a very slight sweetness that wasn't right, not sourness, that you would have caught on the first assessment. Something more preliminary than sourness, the beginning of a process that would be sourness by afternoon. "There," you said, "just beginning." "Beginning is too late for cream," she said. She poured it out. She wrote in the delivery book, "Cream unacceptable. Second morning running. Reduce delivery to half quantity and increase frequency to daily." She handed you the book to take to Mrs. Collins. "How do you know when you haven't smelled it before?" you asked. "You have smelled it before," she said. "Every time something in this kitchen has turned, you have smelled it. You've been building the reference without knowing. You know what correct smells like because you've been smelling correct for 5 months. Off is the deviation. You went to Mrs. Collins with the delivery note. You thought about this on the way. The reference library of smell you'd been building since January. Good stock, bad stock, fresh butter, rancid butter, clean water from the pump, water that had been sitting too long, coal when it was burning right, coal when the air supply was wrong and it was smoking dirty. The particular smell of the kitchen at full operation, at rest, at the transitions between the two. The body-keeping score in another direction, not the damage score but the learning score, the accumulated sensory vocabulary that would eventually make you competent in ways you could not yet fully articulate. You were becoming a cook, slowly, incompletely, with a great deal still ahead. But becoming, there is a particular moment in a long process of learning when you become aware that you have become different from what you were at the beginning. Not finished, never finished probably. The good cooks kept learning until they couldn't, but fundamentally changed. When the gap between who you are now and who you were when you started is greater than the gap between who you are now and who you're trying to become. You couldn't have said when exactly you crossed that line. It wasn't the sauce, though the sauce was real. It wasn't the pastry. It wasn't any single moment. It was something cumulative. Something that added up over months of getting up before dawn and feeding fire and carrying coal and scrubbing surfaces and scalding your hands and getting it wrong and being shown the right way and getting it right and being shown the next wrong thing. Mrs. Hartley, on a Monday morning in late June, handed you the daily list and said, "Get started. Not, here's what you need to do and here's how and watch what I do first. Just get started." You looked at the list. You looked at the kitchen. You looked at the range, which was at low morning temperature and needed bringing up. You got started. The coal first. The firebox adjustments. The damper. The trivet positions for the morning tasks. The stock pot checked. Good. Deep. The stock from last week had become something magnificent and set to simmer. The vegetables from Sid's morning delivery brought in and sorted. The first proper summer squash, deep green and heavy, and runner beans, and a tray of tomatoes that smelled of the greenhouse, and of whatever summer smells like in a good tomato. You worked. The kitchen in the morning light, the north window letting in a slice of it now, broader than winter, reaching further, and the range building its heat and the stock beginning its low, contented simmer, and the smell of the kitchen, which was all of it. Coal and food and the warm metal undertone and the damp stone undertone and the faint particular smell of your own working. The slight alkaline trace of the soda on your hands, the coal tint that still lived in the creases. This smell was the kitchen. This smell was yours now. You had worked in it, slept near it, carried it in your hair and clothes and skin for 5 months. You had been burned by it and frozen in its periphery, and taught by it to listen and smell and feel and anticipate. You had been made different by it. This kitchen that ran on fire and labour and the invisible, continuous work of people below the stairs. That fed the family above it and kept them warm and made the house function in ways they did not need to think about. That cost something daily from the people in it that was not on any ledger. You added coal to the firebox. You adjusted the damper. You stood for a moment with your hands on the range's warm iron, not the hot parts, the safe parts, the sides, and felt the vibration of the fire working inside it, the deep mechanical heartbeat of this machine you'd been learning for 5 months. Warm, steady, burning. You went to start the soup. This is what it is to be a kitchen maid in a Victorian house. To work in the most dangerous room in the building, the room with the fire and the boiling water and the chemicals and the falling things and the gas pipes that seep in winter, and the arsenic green on the walls upstairs that nobody has connected to the headaches yet. To learn the danger until it becomes fluency. To become part of the machinery that makes the house work without the house knowing. To be present and absent at once, essential and invisible, the hands that keep the fire going and the water hot and the food coming, from before light until after dark, every day of every week of every year. To have your body marked by it. The burns, the chilblains, the hands that are permanently a little rough, the lungs that have coal in them, the skin tinted at the creases. To learn anyway. To become, despite the burns and the cost and the invisible labour, a person who can run a kitchen, who can reduce a sauce and read a fire and smell the moment before cream turns and make pastry, that a cook 30 years ahead of you calls better without looking up from her work. To have 2 things at once, the danger and the competence, the cost and the craft, the below-stairs darkness and the particular satisfaction of a job done right, done properly, done with skill and attention, and the accumulated learning of months of getting it wrong. This is what it is. All of it. All of the range and the copper and the chemicals and the scar and the sauce and the penny bun by the river on a Sunday afternoon. The note in the tin trunk. The tea on the scullery step at 10 at night, shared with a girl who has chilblains and wants to be a cook someday. All of it is the kitchen. All of it is the story. The most dangerous room in the Victorian house, and you are still here, and the fire is burning, and tomorrow it all starts again. Let the day go. Let the kitchen settle into its evening quiet, the range banked and ticking, the copper cold and clean, the surfaces scrubbed to their raw, honest pale. Your hands are in your lap. The burn on your arm is 6 months old and white and smooth. Your knuckles have new lines. Your back knows, specifically, the angle of the range and the height of the work table and the weight of a full coal bucket. You are becoming what you're becoming. That will take time. There's time. Let your breathing slow. Let the coal smoke settle. Let the smell of the kitchen, your kitchen now, this kitchen, the one that has been teaching you since January, go from sharp to soft the way it does at the edges of sleep. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. You have earned this rest. Every burn, every blister, every 3 a.m. coal run, every sauce that reduced correctly when you thought you might lose it. All of it was today. All of it was this. Let tomorrow wait at the foot of the stairs where it always waits. Patient, coal dark, ready. For now the kitchen is quiet, for now the fire is just aglow. For now you're just someone tired at the end of a long day, in a room that tried to teach you everything it knew. Let it all go soft at the edges. Let the sounds fade, the creak of the house above the distant street, the last of the gas hissing in its mantle. Let your hands rest. You've earned it. Centuries from now, someone will walk into a preserved Victorian kitchen, restored, roped off, a little too clean, and they'll look at the range and say, "Remarkable. How did they cook on that?" And they'll wonder about the technique, the timing, the skill. But they won't smell the coal. They won't feel the heat. They won't carry the bucket up from the darkness. You did, though. You do. Every morning before anyone else is awake. Every morning just like this. The fire and you. Let sleep come now. Let it take you the way the work always takes you. Completely, without argument. There's nothing left to do tonight. The kitchen has said everything it needed to say. The rest comes later. For now, just rest. Good night.